So when we talk about Lo B'Shamayim, this will be often the seminal source with which you'll begin the question of when you have sort of a divine intervention and questions that are raised, how that impacts the halacha. So the story of Moshe Achnai deals with you had a chatcho cholyot, benaton chol ben cholyot. This particular oven you built, v'zeh tanur shel Achnai, my Achnai. They discussed what Achnai is, and they discussed how they have this question of with which does it have the status of being pure or impure? Okay, what happened? Ba'oto hayom, on that day, Heshiv Rabbi Eliezer kol tshuvot sheba'olam v'lo kiblu imenu. So Rabbi Eliezer was one of the rabbis at the time in the discussion who suggested that the halacha was a certain way, and they asked all sorts of questions against him. And he was the lone wolf. He was the one person who held his opinion, and he responded to every question. He had a rebuttal to any question anybody had. But it was not accepted. Amar lahem, and this is the famous story. If the halacha follows my approach, what's going to happen? This carob tree shall be a proof, and magically, miraculously, the carob tree was uprooted. 100 amot. Rabbi Arba amot. Some suggest it was 4 amot, or Arba me'od amot, 400 amot. Amulo, too bad. The majority opinion said, too bad, ein mivin raya min hacharuv. The fact that a miracle occurred, seemingly as a heaven-sent message that this was the right thing to do, we don't listen to that. So then he had the next story was he had Amad Hamayim, he had the water should turn around and flow backwards, and it did miraculously. Amar, too bad. They're not going to bring a proof from the flow of the water. He says, let the walls of the study hall prove my point, and they started to collapse, as if to show that he is correct. The other rabbis, Rabbi Yeshua, said, no, this is not going to, this is not right, that this should cause destruction of the study hall. So with Rabbi Yeshua prayed, so to speak, and the walls didn't fall down, but they kind of stayed sideways to show that Rabbi Yeshua, that Rabbi Eliezer was correct, but that they didn't want to, destroy the study hall. So the halacha, therefore, was seemingly you had an impasse. You had one opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who said that it was the halacha was a certain way, and he answered all the questions, but you have the majority of the opinions who disagreed. He used all sorts of logical proofs, but they didn't accept them. Then he used miraculous proofs, and they said, sorry, we don't bring proofs for miracles. And so then finally, he says, if the halacha follows me, it should be proven from the heavens. And yatzeta batkol, a voice from the heavens rang out, that the halacha, indeed, the rules follow this opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. Amad Rabbi Yeshua Raglav, Rabbi Yeshua, one of the other sages, arose on his feet and declared, Lo Bashamayim he, that the practical application of Jewish law is not something determined by heaven. Once the Torah was given, it's up to us, the humans, the human race, the authorities within Jewish law to delineate what the halacha should be. And therefore, even if a voice from God comes out and says, follow Rabbi Eliezer, too bad. We're ignoring that voice from God, and we are going to only follow Rabbi Yehoshua and the majority opinion. And so the Gemara elucidates and elaborates and says, my lo bashamayim. What does it mean, lo bashamayim? He Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah shekvar nitna Torah me'ar Sinai. Einanu mashkichim mebat kol. That once the Torah was given on Har Sinai, we will no longer follow a voice from heaven. That's what he says. The Torah was given. And what does the Torah say? Shekvar katva bar Sinai b'Torah. In the Torah it says, Achari Rabim lahatot. You should follow the majority opinion. So even though the minority opinion, right, it's a democratic process, so to speak. The minority opinion, Rabbi Eliezer, had proofs from the texts. He had proofs from the miracles. He had proofs from a voice coming out from God. All of that falls by the wayside, and we follow the majority opinion, which is what's delineated in the Torah. Ashkechei Rabbi Natan Eliyahu, one of the rabbis, found Eliyahu Navi, Amarle, and he said to him, my Avad Kuchabricha by Hishata. What was going on up in heaven as they watched this story unfold? Amarle, Kachayech, God was smiling and said, Nitzchuni banai. My children, so to speak, have triumphed over me. So that's the famous story of Tanuro Shel Achnai. The story of Achnai's oven. Again, the story of the oven itself is less relevant than the aftermath. Sorry about that. The aftermath of the story. So now, the basic thrust of what's being taught here is Lo b'shamayim, that once the Torah is given, once the Torah is taught, we are also given rules of the road, so to speak. And one of the rules of the road is we follow the majority opinion. Now, immediately there, that's what's well known. Immediately there is a let me just see if I can let's see, I can find this to share with you here. Fell down here. There is a comment by Tosfot, and the comment by Tosfot actually is less well known and raises a more complex issue here. So Tosfot there says on that while commenting on those words, lo b'shamayim he. I'm just going to try and share it again here. Sorry, my share got disabled for a moment. Here we go. And the words lo b'shamayim he. Here's what Tosfos says. Tosfos says right here, lo b'shamayim. Tosfos asked the following question. Tosfos says, there's a Gemara, a Talmud in Eruvin, and a Talmud in Masechet Yevamot that says, halacha kebeit Hillel. Now, we've heard of the famous opinions of Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. They argue all over the place about this, that, and the other, right? Stories about their arguments, the many, many Mishnayot that delineate their arguments. Who do we follow? The general consensus is we always follow Beit Hillel. And says Tosfot, the Gemara, the Talmud teaches us why we follow Beit Hillel. And the Gemara says, Halacha kebeit Hillel mishum tiyatza bat kol. That there was a voice from heaven at some point that rang out and said, you know what? You should always follow Beit Hillel. So the Gemara in Eruvin and Gemara in Yevamot declare that the halacha is meant to be like Beit Hillel. So now Tos says, I'm stuck, right? I'm stuck. If we are supposed to say that we don't listen to any supernatural intervention in our process, so to speak, right? That we are now, once the Torah is given, we are now given the autonomy to define and express the halacha. And we don't listen even to the greatest of sources, even God coming down from heaven. Well, there is the Gemara in Eruvin that seems to say, here, here, I have it here at the bottom here. The Gemara in Eruvin says the following. Amar Rabbi Abba Amar Shmuel, Shalosh Shanim, for 3 full years, Nechluku Beit Shammai Beit Hillel. Halalu Amar Lacha Kamotenu, right? Beit Shammai Beit Hillel argued. Beit Shammai said the halacha should follow us. Beit Hillel said the halacha should follow us. Yatza bat kol, a voice from heaven declared. Yeah, it came out and declared, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokeim chaimim, famous phrase, that these Elu ve'elu. This is the source of that term, elu ve'elu. V'halacha kebeit Hillel. And the halacha follows Beit Hillel. Now, here's a really important addendum to that Gemara. Gemara says, if it's true that both are the words of God, so to speak, both have truth to them, what was the reason Beit Hillel merited to follow the halacha like him? That they were more respectful and they were more easygoing, so to speak. When they would say over, when they would discuss the halacha, they would quote the opposing opinion before they'd say their own opinion. And not only that, first of all, they would quote the opposing opinion, but they would say it first. So the halacha follows Beit Hillel. So now we have Tosfot raised a very significant contradiction. On one hand, you have the famous story of Tanuro Shel Achnai, the story we just told you about the water and the wood and the this and the that. And we rejected that because we said, sorry, we're in charge now, not you, God. And God seemingly, according to the Talmud, accepted that. On the other hand, you have a very famous, a very basic argument being settled, it appears, by a bat kol from the Shamayim, by some sort of heavenly intervention. Which is it? Do we listen to heavenly intervention or do we not? So that's the question raised by Tosfot. So Tosfot offers a fascinating answer. And Tosfot says the following. And again, just to review, we seem to have a contradiction. One piece of the Talmud says that you don't listen to voices from heaven. The other opinion says you do. And here's a Tosfot response. Tosfot says, let me just see. Here we go. Tosfot says that, right? Shani hacha. It's different over here. She ba lachlok al divrei Torah. Dichtei v'acharei rabim latot. V'hatam adraba Beit Hillel ruba. All right. So Tosfot says the following. Tosfot says there is a difference between the story that we told about the oven and the falling walls and the water and all those things. That's the story of Tanuro Shel Achnai, and the story of listening to a voice from heaven when it comes to Beit Hillel. It says that when we have a voice from heaven that contradicts an already accepted Torah principle, then we ignore any supernatural or otherworldly sign or intervention. So in the story of Rabbi Eliezer and the walls and the water and the voice from heaven, what was the voice from heaven basically telling the people to do? Is saying, ignore the majority, follow the minority opinion. And so we say no. When you're faced with a contradiction between what's already in the Torah and this new voice from heaven, you go with what's already in the Torah. And the Torah says, follow the majority. Done. As opposed to Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, following Beit Hillel was actually in agreement with principles from the Torah. That Beit Hillel happened to be the majority against Beit Shammai. So we follow Beit Hillel not because or per se the voice from heaven. The voice from heaven bolstered what we already accept as the rule. And if that's the case, then we do not discount a voice from heaven. And then it's so if the voice from heaven bolsters the approach, or at least doesn't contradict something we already hold as from the Torah, then we'll listen. If the voice from heaven, if the supernatural or the otherworldly sign does not comport with what we already have as the rules, then, there's a rule in the Torah, you must follow the majority, then we do not listen to the voice from heaven, and that's the story of Tanuro Shel Achnai. So that's the groundwork, so to speak, of this question of using, something, otherworldly happens, and you say, it's a sign. Well, not so fast. If it's something that is already in accordance to Torah principles, that's fine. But if it's something that contradicts something that is an accepted principle, then we say lo b'shamayim. This is not Torah is no longer in heaven. Yeah, Suzanne, go ahead. You need to unmute.
There's another reason here, and that has nothing to do with the rov that Hillel was very conveniently the majority.
Mm-hmm.
If when there is a machloket that both sides are sticking to the written Torah, but one is the machmir and the other one is the
lenient.
Mm-hmm. One is with chumrah and the other one with leniency.
Mm-hmm.
Since it says that you should live by the Torah says if both of them are right, and one says no, the rule is like that, and we cover the tahar and so on and so forth, then go for what it is easier for people to follow.
So you're saying that there's that's perhaps
it's in the case when both sides are right.
Yeah, that's so, and we have rules like safik to oraita l'chumra, safik to rabbanan l'kula. We have rules about being lenient and strict, but I think maybe what your point is that's what was getting at when it was highlighting the more respectful and more collegial tone that was taken by Beis Hillel, right? And that perhaps highlighted the reason for the following the halacha. Interestingly, if you look, Tosfot actually adds another answer. Tosfot has another answer. Says, you know what? How else will resolve this contradiction? So Tosfot says that the other answer is that usually we will listen to a voice from heaven, but they knew that the voice from heaven in this case of the Tanura Shalachnai was purely so wouldn't be to help Rabbi Eliezer save face, but it wasn't actually meant to. It was mishum kvodo, mishum kvodo to Rabbi Eliezer. It wasn't actually meant to, fall to help Rabbi Eliezer actually win the case, and that's what it ends in Tzchuni Banai. But it seems that Tosfot raises the possibility of using some level of supernatural or otherworldly proof to actually impact the halacha. Now, the Rambam takes this concept, though, and takes it in a totally different direction. The Rambam says that this story proves to us the limitations on prophecy. What do I mean? He says that, what is this telling us? It's telling us that once the Torah is given, done. There's no new rules, no new edicts. Only, obviously you're going to have the rules that the rabbis do as interpretation of the Torah, but if a prophet, at the time there was prophecy, would come and say to you, all right, I'm teaching you some brand new thing, we would tell him, sorry, Charlie, lo b'shamayim, the Torah is no longer in heaven. If you're trying to bring us a new halacha from the heavens, we're not going to accept it. So the Rambam says, the Rambam goes as far and says that if a prophet would come at the time there was prophecy and say the halacha is true about X, Y, or Z, you're allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that. And they'd say, okay, prove it to us. What's your source? What pasuk? What verse in the Talmud? What this and that? He says, I'll prove it to you. I had a prophecy. And in my prophecy, I was told by God himself that this is the halacha. And you know what we would do to that person, says the Rambam? We'd ignore them. You have prophecies about Jeremiah and Yechezkel, and all of the prophets would give prophecies about issues of ethics and issues of values. But if they were going to come and teach you a new halacha, out the door. That's what the
You got disconnected, Rabbi.
Sorry for the interruption there. Just had to tend to just household importance. All right, so that's the Rambam's view. The Rambam's view is that the halacha we would ignore a prophet who uses his prophecy or her prophecy as the proof to a particular halachic position. So the Rambam has an interesting question. He says, and I'll show you here, the Rambam says, and this is the Laws of Torah, the Rambam says, well, in Cain, if that's the case, Lama nemar b'Torah v'yakim lehem mikarav achayim kamocha. Why does the Torah say that sometimes they're going to be prophets if we're not going to listen to them? And it says, God says, I'm going to have prophets and I'm going to put my words in their mouth and you'll have to listen to them. So he says, lo laso dat huba. Dot from the word of religion. It's not meant to tell you a religious law. It's to command them to follow the Torah and to make sure that you warn them that they should not violate the Torah. It tells you where to go, where to go. Do this kind of war, that kind of war, build this wall, that wall, that's fine. Mitzvah l'shmolo. However, if he tells you, no, the halacha is X versus Y based on a prophecy, we don't listen. That's what the Rambam's view is. So the Rambam takes this, I would call it in a certain regard, rationalist approach very seriously. He says, we don't listen to prophecy when it comes to the law. And again, it comes from this notion of, lo bashamayim. When it comes to the law, we do not listen. We say the law is not in heaven. The Kesef Mishnah, one of the commentaries on the Rambam, actually says, one second, Kasheli, I have a hard time with this, because didn't we learn about Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai that we follow them based on a bat kol? And he quotes the Tosot we mentioned. He says, Vav Tzadi Aleph. Vav Tzadi Aleph means Vitzarich Iyun, which is a way of saying, that's a really good question that I don't have an answer to. But the Rambam does lay out that it seems clear that we will not follow a voice from heaven, right? We're very godly people, but when God says this, we ignore him, even if it's through a Navi, even if it's through a prophet, which is a really interesting, an interesting approach. The Tosfot seem to say, yeah, you know what? Sometimes God speaks in cool ways, and we should listen unless it goes against something in the halacha. The Rab says, no, we will not listen. So there is a really interesting halacha. Have you ever heard of mansepach? I'll say it again. Mansepach. What's mansepach? Mansepach is mem, nun, tzadi, pei, chaf. Mansepach. Now, mansepach is the 5 letters in the Hebrew alphabet that change if they're at the end of the word, called an ot sofit. Right? Mem as a mem sofit, nun sofit, tzadi sofit, pei sofit, chaf sofit. Mansepach. The Talmud actually, and there's lots of scholarly research on this, but the Talmud actually says that there is a ancient source, right? You ever wonder why we would just change certain letters if they're at the end of the word? So the Talmud says the following. The Talmud says in Masechet Megillah, Mansepach, Amar Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Yirmiyah is often involved in these kind of things. Vitem Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Mansepach, or here you go, the letters, Mem, Nun, Tzadi, Pei, Chaf. Mansepach, Sofim Amarun. Now, you may be familiar with the word Sofim from there's a famous youth movement called the Tzofim, but this means Tzofim means seers. Litzpot means to see, the seers, and it's another term for Nevi'im. And the Gemara says, one second, V'tizbara, let's try and understand this. V'aktiv, it says in the Torah, Elo mitzvot, she'ein navi rashai lechadesh davar me'ata. That this is really a powerful innovation, that you're telling me that the prophets, based on prophecy, decided that they would innovate and say, you know what, from the go on, these letters are now going to have a different form when they come at the end of the word. And so it says, so that's the question. This is answered later in the discussion. It says, Shechachum v'chazru v'yisedum. That it sounds like that what the Talmud is saying is that these letters having the Sofit, having the end letter be different, that was actually even more ancient than the prophets. It was just forgotten. It used to be that before the prophets, people started writing tzadis at the end of the letter, at the end of the word. By the way, you see in transliterated words, you see some of that now. But the Nevi'im, all they did was they were not innovating. They were just reminding people, oh, by the way, these 5 letters are actually supposed to be written differently when they're at the end of the word. Okay? Now, here, if you take a look at Rashi, though, Rashi says, Sofim Amru Nevi'ei Hadorot, and Rashi says that this was done al pi hadibur. Al pi hadibur means that they had this revelation, so to speak, and that revelation told them, okay, we're gonna now change these letters when they come to the end of the word. So, according to Tosfot, no problem. According to Tosfot, the Tosfot is basically saying they weren't violating anything in the Torah, so that's fine. They heard a prophecy from God that they were supposed to rejuvenate this concept of you're supposed to have these letters written differently. No problem. When they hear something from God, we can listen as long as it doesn't contradict something in the Torah, which, we don't find anywhere in the Torah. The Torah cares what, letters look like at the end of the word. The Rambam seems to be a little bit more complicated, because the Rambam seems to very much limit the ability that prophets have to innovate. So maybe they'll say it wasn't really innovating because it was always there. But for the Rambam, this is a little bit more difficult, because it seems like they are saying, based on our prophecy, you should do a different thing in the way you write Hebrew, which is a pretty momentous suggestion. And for the Sofim, so to speak, and Rashi says the Nevi'ei Hadorot, to innovate that is a very powerful and really world-changing thing now that we write Hebrew differently. By the way, this has very significant halachic implications. Once this is the case, if you would write a halachic document and you would not write it in the correct way, it would be invalid. And so this, mansapach is extremely, extremely important. And the Rambam should be telling us we shouldn't listen to it. So these sources touched off a debate over generations, because during different times in Jewish history, there was a real, I would say, a movement in ebbs and flows and waves of the infusion of mysticism into practical halachic practice. Last night we had a lecture by Dr. Abramson. I don't know if anybody was able to be on, where he talked about the innovations and the rise of the Hasidic movement. And he mentioned about how you had this be a linchpin of their arguments, where the Hasidim would say, the phrase was "kalta like a Litvak," right? That you're cold like a Lithuanian. That they did not, and part of the issue was that they were not infused any sort of feeling and emotion, but also that there was, although the Vilna Gaon, who was the key source of the Misnagdim, was a great Kabbalist, and was well versed in lots of mystical texts, didn't feel that the Lithuanian tradition was a lot more set in their ways, and the Hasidic tradition, especially as it infused not only the Baal Shem Tov, but really the Lurianic tradition, which means the Arizal, the Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, who was a very mystical thinker and innovated a nusach of the Sidur that was taken on by a variety of Hasidic movements. So you had a lot of infusion of the mystical into practical halacha. Take that a step further, where you have the Zohar, right? Again, Lag BaOmer is sort of, now the Zohar, on one hand, is a purely mystical work, and what's interesting is that while it became a mainstay of study in the Hasidic movement, in the opponents of the Hasidim, they didn't discount the Zohar per se. What they did do was say, you're very limited in who can study it. First, it was only when you were 25 you were allowed to study it, because it was sort of these mystical secrets. Then they actually raised the age to 40, where you could study it. And part of it was this reticence that we see, I think, also echoing in the Rambam, of allowing there to be any sort of mystical infusion into the practical halachic process. But the you must contend with the fact that there are many different halachot that will, if you look and deeply source their provenance, you'll find that they have certain certain source material from within the mystical Zohar tradition. You look all through Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim, and you'll find all sorts of cases where it says you should do it this way, or say it this way, or say this, or say that, because of a Zohar HaKadosh, because something that is from the Zohar. And if that's the case, the Rambam, we should have a big problem with a lot of different halachic practices. Minhagim, by the way, you want to know one of the places where you find a lot of this is in the laws of Avelut, the laws of mourning, both in terms of the aftermath, the laws of Chevra Kadisha and the laws of the funeral practices. Many of those are deeply rooted in all sorts of mystical traditions, where, again, you might think that the Rambam would have a major problem with all of that. So interestingly, the Sdei Chemed, is the work by Chaim Yosef David Azulai, although it's actually not by him, but it's quoted in the Machzik Bracha, which is one of the books by the Chida. But the Sdei Chemed is a more encyclopedic work, and he says there are times where, and he decides, I'm going to set some rules where you can use Zohar mystical sources and where you can't. So take a look what he says here. The Zohar has in what's called the Klalei Poskim, which is, the Sdei Chemed has the Klalei Poskim, which are the laws of how you are going to be machriya, going to delineate and practice the halacha. So the Sdei Chemed says the following, really interesting. He says, Zohar Zayin Hekuf, Zohar HaKadosh. When you have something in the Zohar, right, a mystical tradition, ki palig al hashas, when it will argue with something that is in the established Talmudic tradition. Hey, Chiyavdinan, how are we supposed to act? What do you do when you have the Zohar and that it it seems to go against, right? And there's, I'll quote a bunch of examples. So he says, Shebedavar shebetalmud didan, in our Talmudic tradition, where it is mifurash, it is clear and explicit, heifech, against, opposite what it says in the Zohar, naktina ketalmud didan. So he says, when there is a conflict between a mystical tradition and the more rationalist Talmudic tradition, you follow the Talmud. Again, and I'll just up to this point. You can't ignore what is in the established tradition based on something that you'll see in a mystical source. Now, v'davar she'eino mefurish b'shas, ela b'divrei poskim, v'uhefech divrei ba'alei kabbalah. But let's say a new topic comes up, and you don't find it anywhere in traditional sources. But what you do find is some mystical sources that talk about it. It says, then we will follow the sources, even that they come from the mystical tradition. So the Sechemed, in his rules that they're sort of collating all of this, actually says sometimes, yes, b'shamayim, we do use this, again, supernatural or otherworldly type of sources. And he says that the story, one of the famous is Brich Shmei, one of the parts of davening, one of the parts of daily prayer that happens on Mondays and Thursdays and Shabbat is that when you take out the Torah, you say a paragraph in Aramaic called Brich Shmei. That paragraph is a quote from the Zohar in Parshat Vayakel. It's part of our Sidur. So, what's interesting is that the Stechamed, the Machzik Bracha writes, this is a wild statement. This is Reb Chaim Yosef David Zulai. He was the chief rabbi of Baghdad and a very, very prolific author on areas of halacha. Look what he says here in the Laws of Shabbat. He says, look here. V'teim al Rabbanan Batraya barim lachlok al Rabbeinu Arizal befeirush hazohar shall kol dvarav sod shatu ashar shamayim. He says that when you have accepted practice that is based on the mystical tradition, you shouldn't argue with it. And he says, ubifrat, and especially elamakom asher diber b'kodsho divrei Arizal zasal, that when there are Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, the Arizal, suggests something about a practice that is not contradicted anywhere in the Talmud, says you should of course follow the Arizal. Listen to this. Asher niglu elav ha'elokim. It's as if he had gotten a divine revelation that told him that this is the way you should act. So it seems really very, on one hand, we have big parts of our tradition and the scholarly tradition of Jewish scholarship that does seem to accept using mystical sources. And yet we see in the Rambam a big reticence to even prophets, even true prophets, to accept what they're saying when it comes to the practical halacha. By the way, have you heard of ever the term in a Talmud called teku? Teku is an acronym, or at least is often translated as an acronym, and it comes at the end of a dispute in the Talmud. And there'll be a dispute in the Talmud about all sorts of different things, and there'll be this opinion that says X and this opinion that says Y, and at the end it'll say, teku, which means teku in modern Hebrew means to tie. That we don't prove like one opinion or the other. But there's a famous tradition that teku translates as Tishbi Yitaretz Kushyot Uvayot. Tishbi means Eliyahu Hanavi, right? Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Tishbi, which means that Elijah will come and answer this question for us. We don't know the answer now. We can't figure out if Rava's right or Abaye is right, or this one's right or that one's right, whatever. So we'll wait for Eliyahu and Avi to come and reveal to us what the law is. And you're wondering, one second, didn't we just say on one hand that this is the concept of lo bashamayim, that that the Torah has this set, right? Elu hadvarim, these are the words of the Torah. You have no right to add and innovate outside of the process that is given to you as part of the Jewish exegetical tradition, meaning interpreting the words of the Torah and the Talmud. And yet, you see all these things. Oh, don't worry, we don't know. We don't have the tools to interpret it with our tools. So we'll wait for Eliyahu to tell us. I don't know. I thought lo bashamayim, isn't it not in the heavens? Isn't that exactly the point where the Rambam was teaching us? So the Chassam Sofer has a really interesting approach. The Chassam Sofer basically says that there's all sorts of stories, right? Even in the Talmud itself, it talked about how during the story of Achnai Zavin, one of the sages checked in with Eliyahu Hanavi, checked in with Elijah, and said, "Hey, give me a situation report of what's going on in heaven right now." Now, isn't relying on Elijah the prophet, a violation of lo bashamayim? So the Chassam Sofer suggests that if the Elijah kind of a quote is based on when Eliyahu Hanavi is speaking as from the history of Eliyahu Hanavi and things that he said, so to speak, not as a angel or angelic figure, but as a Adam. So then he says, okay, so you can accept that because it's like any other person who's giving you something smart to say. If it's the revelation of Elijah is based on a in a supernatural angelic way, well, then we would say we're not allowed to follow Elijah the prophet. That's going to be a violation of lo bashamayim, and the Torah is not in the heavens. So it's like wild, right? The Chassam Sofer is saying that it depends how you can listen to Elijah, but depends how he shows up. Is he showing up as a human, in which case he has the rules of a human and he can suggest something through his great wisdom and you can follow it, or is he showing up as an angel? Now, this doesn't help when you have all sorts of stories of people saying, I had a dream, and in my dream, it was, I was, I got some epiphany that I'm supposed to follow X, Y, or Z. Do you follow such things or not? But you see, there's lots of halachot that people say, oh, I had some, epiphany, and that's the way that I'm going to paskin halacha. I'm going to follow the halacha. So the approach that the Chida takes is, I think, the sort of back and forth here, is that what's actually going on here is that we don't expect the human condition, the human body of psak, which means that actually telling, practical guidance of what to do, to be based on mystical sources. We don't. It's not true in the story about Tam Nura Shalachnai, the Bat Kol, etc. He says what can happen is for people to feel divinely inspired. You think about something, you work on it somewhere, you say, a eureka moment. And what perhaps the sort of the sources are telling us is that we don't think that these eureka moments are anything different than the way that God makes a decision if somebody should live, or somebody, or a blade of grass should grow, or you should be divinely inspired, or you should have inspiration that you are, thinking of something that's a really good idea. So if you can point back to some sort of logical process that you say, you know what, I had this great epiphany and I'm thinking, you know what, I should follow this particular halacha, I should follow this opinion, then you could say, all right, so that's God inspired me, but only if you can link it back to something that is part of our, so to speak, logical tradition. If it's, as they say, parech ba'avir, if it's purely not something that has a source, or it contradicts a source that we have, or it's not something that you can point to some way, it's not just I had this great inspiration, I'm thinking this great idea, but it is, I have no idea why this is true, but it's been revealed in some way. So then we say, Elo hadvarim, eina navi rashai lechadesh, that you can't innovate and bring a new idea just based on your intuition. Interestingly, that actually crosses a little slippery slope, or I should say that puts a stopgap on a slippery slope, because if we would accept the idea that somebody just says, God told me this and this is what everybody should start doing, other than the Navi that the Rambam delineated, you have an opening to some really complicated and tough types of things that anybody could show up and say, oh, I had a revelation from God and this is what we should do. So we do have that healthy skepticism of trying to infuse that rational approach within the acceptance of Lo B'Shamayim. Anyway, it's always connected to Lag BaOmer, because Lag BaOmer is this time of this celebration. It's often associated with the mystical. But again, if you are a Catholic that you can understand that there is a mystical tradition within the Torah, but it always has to loop back in to connect to something that is part of our more classical tradition, then you'll at least be grounded and not be open to all sorts of different non-proven type of innovations, almost as far as the Rambam goes to say, which is that we would never accept something unless it's actually a divorced, so to speak, from the practical halacha. All right, so I wanted to stop because I know there's some questions. Go ahead, Susanna.
We see today too that we see two poskim that have an opposite opinion, and both of them are basing, the basis is something in the halacha which can be applied, and it can be applied. Two different halachot can also be applied. So, so I mean, they try to do that way.
Yeah. And it's a really fascinating study about how you say, no, this is going to be too heebie-jeebie for us, and this is the Zohar, it's a mystical tradition, we should say Brishmei. Yeah, go ahead, Susan.
Can I ask for another lesson to think about? How is this process going on with Rabbinic?
Yeah, it's a really great question. It's a really good question about the evolution of rabbinic thought. Yeah.
Yes.
I have the feeling that in the past we had very big steps in alleviating the situation for the population.
The idea of Ein Gozrin Gzer El Tzibur, Elaim Ken Rov Tzibur Mechalam. We don't make a rule that people can't follow, that kind of thing. Yeah.
It's posvul, mechirat chametz, so many things.
Yeah.
And I think I would like to see the statistics. How much of Midirabanan were innovated during the time, in what period quantitatively? Because I have the feeling that we are getting more and more fossilized.
It's interesting. There's a tremendous amount of, and I'd say, I don't know if you were to join Dr. Abramson, I think next week he's going to talk about that a little bit. There's a tremendous amount of literature on exactly that topic of the growth and evolution and revolution of rabbinic thought, and it's a really fascinating topic.
Can you give us
let me see.
Something that is good for lay people, not for women, please.
Sure. All right. Have a wonderful day. have a wonderful day. Wish everybody a great Shabbos, and
Thank you.
we'll be in touch.
Okay, thank you.